I don't know why it is doing that. Let us
Hello
see.
everyone, my name's Michael Trousdale. I'm a trustee of Our Lady of Grace Parish Buildings Preservation Trust and very pleased to have Nikos Karydis here representing the team who've been working on the heritage statement for Our Lady of Grace Church. We're very excited to have been able to do work very quickly with Nikos and Cassandra Harrington working together on the production of this work. So very much looking forward to hearing about it.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's been a pleasure working with you and investigating the Church of Our Lady of Grace. So I will share my screen to give you an overview of the work carried out so far. So the work carried out that I'm going to present is the heritage statement, which constitutes the first part of a conservation plan for a plan for the future preservation of this unique building. This was we were assigned to carry out this heritage statement at a very challenging time for the church. There is a current debate regarding its future ownership and management. The church itself, even though it's of exceptional value, is not listed and is facing certain structural defects. So the role of the conservation plan we're preparing is to provide a guide for the repair and future management of the site. And an essential basis for this conservation plan is an understanding of the significance of the building. And to understand the significance, we need to understand the history of the building. And that's the first thing that we investigated. The history of the broader site is associated with the history of the East Combe estate, which you see in this 19th century map. This was a large estate that is associated with illustrious owners, but a very important point from our perspective is the separation of 3 plots from this broader site, 3 plots facing Charlton Road, and each of these plots had, from the beginning of the 19th century, a manor house built into it. So these large manor houses were East Combe, Little Combe, and at the center, High Combe House that you see here in this picture. Now, this High Combe House is, of course, had illustrious owners or occupants, one of them being William Congreve, the famous inventor of the Congreve rocket and an expert and pioneer in artillery science. It was also, the house was occupied by Barlow, the famous engineer, who worked on, most notably, on St. Pancras Station. The modern history of the site, and particularly relevant for the history of the Church of Our Lady of Grace, begins in 1903 when mothers Miriam and Julie Frank acquire the High Combe House in coordination with the Order of the Augustinians of the Assumption and the Archdiocese in the Southwark Diocese. So this has been unknown. So the involvement of these 2 mothers has been little known so far, but it has particular relevance for the value of the church, because it is in particular under the leadership of the younger of the 2 sisters, Julie Frank, that the church is commissioned and designed. Her sister, Miriam Frank, the older sister, is a very important historical figure for the history of the Catholic Church. She's an established, she was a sculptor, and in this slide you can see one of her works, and she was famous for the founding of charities and congregations whose mission was to educate orphans, to teach music and sculpture. Her latest institution that Miriam Frank founded was in Bouscat in Bordeaux, and its buildings are still survive. They include a mansion house and a chapel attached to it. Now Miriam probably provided much of the sculpture for the church of the original sculpture of the Church of Our Lady of Grace. So there are many new narratives that we discovered that are associated with the church. After establishing herself in Heikum House, Julie Frank, together with 11 of her followers, started building a parish, and as we mentioned, they commissioned the church of Our Lady of Grace, which was commissioned in 1905. It was completed in 1906. The architect for the church was Eugène Gervais, who was based in Bordeaux, and to whom we will return. The involvement, this first period of the site finishes in 1912, when internal disputes actually force Julie Frank to abandon the Charlton parish that she had founded, which included a school, most notably. The site of Heikum House and the Church of Our Lady of Grace was taken over by the Augustinians of the Assumption. In the next phase in the development of the site is in the 1920s. As this photograph shows, that is the period when the parish hall was built, right opposite the other side of the church, facing the church and enclosing the forecourt of Heikum House. This period also probably contributed the Tribune Gallery that is still survives in the church, as we can tell from the observation of details such as the stairwell leading to it and the columns that support it. In the 1940, on 16th of September 1940, the church was bombed, as we found from our archival research. It was hit by 6 incendiary bombs that caused damage in the sacristy and the room above it, and the northern part of the roof. And the damage was patched up very quickly, and the church kept being used throughout the war. It wasn't until the late 1950s that repair started. And this was much more than simple repair. From 1958 to 1959, there was a drastic intervention which gave the church much of its modern form and shape. This intervention involved the extension of the church towards the west with a new baptistry, a new lady chapel, confessionals, and the west side entrance to sacristies. Notably, as we will see later on, it involved the underpinning of the floor of the sanctuary. So this completes this short overview completes the overview of the history of the church. Now the other part of the heritage statement involves an analysis of the architecture of the church, which tries to situate the church within the development of church architecture. Given that the church has some associations with Romanesque architecture, may create the false impression that, in fact, it's a derivative building. But it actually is a much more complex design, as we will see. So our architectural analysis began from the section, which completes the existing survey. So we carried out the section that you see here. And this section helped not only to observe the design of the church in detail, but also to understand what the influences of this design may have been, or indeed how this design may have looked originally. As you see here, this variation of the section shows the original design carried out by the architect prior to the addition of the tribune and the extension towards the west. We looked also into the buildings and the traditions that influenced the design by Jean Gervais in 1905. And we realized that even though the Romanesque revival became unpopular in the United Kingdom following the 1850s, it was very relevant and kept influencing church architecture in France. And looking at Romanesque revival churches of the 50s and 60s, we were able to understand how the design that Gervais carried out is actually very much inspired from these developments. As illustrated in these two churches I'm showing here, the Church of Charenton-le-Pont by Claude Nesson, or the Basilica of La Louvesque by Pierre Bossan. Looking at the context, the French context within which the design for Our Lady of Grace was carried out by a French architect, we realized that at the time when the church was built, there was a trend to simplify the design of churches. So to continue using these Romanesque precedents, but in a very simplified form, as for instance in the Church of Saint-Jean-Baptiste de la Salle in Paris. To understand the place of the church, it's important to take into account the British context as well, the context of Edwardian architecture. And there the situation is very different because in England, the architects, church architects, preferred the revival of perpendicular Gothic architecture to the revival of Romanesque architecture. And this is illustrated in buildings such as St. Barnabas by Caro, which has many perpendicular Gothic features and doesn't have any relationship with Romanesque. But what is interesting is that in the Edwardian context in England, there is also a trend to simplify architectural forms and try to make all those sources, all the forms that make up a style more cohesive. And this is illustrated in the Church of St. Hilda in Crompton Park. So with these comparisons in mind, both from the French background and the English background, we are able to understand better what makes Our Lady of Grace, the Church of Our Lady of Grace, unique and specific. We realize that the ingenuity of the design lies in the way that it synthesizes diverse influences in individual elements. So it's not eclectic pastiche, but it's a very, very carefully considered design. Externally, it has very sophisticated three-dimensional effects. There is a very elaborate, sculpturally elaborate elevation, as you can see. And internally, all those different stylistic references are combined together in a cohesive and rich design, which is rich in sculpture and craftsmanship and includes unique theatrical features, like, for instance, the sanctuary with its double niche, effectively creating a stunning backdrop to the original sculpture. But the merit of the church extends to its construction, and to understand the value of this from this aspect, we looked at the context of the development of construction technology and realized that when the church was being built, a revolution was taking place in terms of construction methods. And this, especially with respect to churches, reinforced concrete was slowly starting to be incorporated in church construction. An example of this, of course, is Sidwell Street Church in Exeter. And of course, in France, there were already churches that were designed and built with a patent of reinforced concrete, which was belonged to François Hennebique. Now, this is particularly relevant because the Church of Our Lady of Grace uses extensively reinforced concrete. This can be seen from the observation of the ceiling of the crypt, which is the floor of the sanctuary, but also was established by scanning aspects of the church, such as the columns, the arches, the nave vaults, etc. So our survey established that Our Lady of Grace constitutes one of the earliest examples of the extensive use of reinforced concrete in church construction in the UK. But the significance of the building extends also to its association with a very prominent architect. Eugène Gervais was a very prominent French architect with an official role as architect of the region of Gironde. He was associated with the École of Beaux-Arts in Bordeaux. He was the winner of competitions such as the one that you see in this slide. And he had executed works in Belgium, outside France. So he was a very prominent architect and very prolific. And Our Lady of Grace constitutes his only known British work, but other projects of his, such as, for instance, apartment buildings in Bordeaux or these fascinating villas in Royan, show the how prolific he was as an architect and how successful he was. So to summarize, this heritage statement has convinced us that Our Lady of Grace is a rare and irreplaceable example of modern religious heritage. It preserves its original features and is in its pioneering use of reinforced concrete in its current structure. It has exceptional historical significance by connection with the Augustinians of the Assumptions and Mothers Miriam and Julie Frank. It has a very important communal significance as the home of a vibrant Catholic community. So protection and listing of this architectural gem is vital to safeguard the church and its site for future generations.
Thank you, Nikos. That was fascinating to hear all of that. To hear there, I just had one question, reflecting on the listing work that, of course, Historic England would do, and whether you have any thoughts about the listing grade. Would it be a grade 2 star or the more general grade 2 listing?
The more I investigated the history and the architecture of the church, the more I realized how important it is, and the more I was surprised that it hadn't already been listed. I understand that the church meets all the criteria for listing in terms of architectural, archaeological, and historical significance. It is a very unique example in this respect in many, many ways. So possibly it could be considered for a 2-star listing, but I'm sure that our colleagues at Historic England have a full overview of listed buildings, and they will be able to assess the significance of the building in its broad context.
Brilliant. Thank you, and thank you to Cassandra as well for the work that you've both done on this really great heritage statement.
Wonderful, thank you. That's the recording.